Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We're looking at the language of Jesus in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 35, where he, speaking as a good Jewish prophet, said, "Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words will by no means pass away." And people go to this passage as almost a definitive statement of Jesus saying literal, material, physical heaven and earth is going to pass away one of these days. They ignore the connection with verse 2 and 3, in which the context is clearly the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, the question, I think, is legitimate to ask. Upon what basis do we ignore the Old Testament testimony and use of the language of the passing of heaven and earth when we come to Matthew 24:35? Paul Manier, a very noted scholar, in his book on biblical apocalyptic language, that's not the title, but it's what it's all about, makes the following comment, a paraphrase. If anybody wants the exact reference and the exact paraphrase, I'll be glad to give it to you. But Paul Manier makes the observation that neither Jesus or any New Testament writer goes out of their way to explain the meaning or the definition of the language that they use in talking about the passing of heaven and earth. Now, Manier was commenting on the language of Matthew 24:35, on the language of 2 Peter chapter 3. And he says no New Testament writer ever explains the use of that language. They took it for granted, number one, that their readers understood that they were quoting from, that they were drawing on the language of the Old Testament. They understood, number two, that the use of that language was to be understood in a given way. And number three, they understood that the readers would understand they were using the language in exactly the same way. Therefore, and here's the whole point, if the New Testament writers do, and obviously they do, if the New Testament writers and speakers, as Matthew 24 verse 35 is clearly a case of Jesus speaking, not writing, but if and since the New Testament writers quote verbatim from the Old Testament, and they even tell us that they're reminding us of what the Old Testament foretold, and in those Old Testament passages that they cite, that they allude to, that they quote, the language is clearly, demonstrably metaphoric, figurative, hyperbolic, non-literal. That's a mouthful, isn't it? But if it's easily shown that that language was never intended to be taken literally, then upon what basis do we come to the New Testament and we read passages like Matthew 24:35, heaven and earth shall pass away, and all of a sudden we jump ship, we reject the entire prophetic database and use of language, and we insist, well, he's got to be talking of the passing of literal physical heaven and earth. So, we've already looked at Isaiah chapter 13, a passage that uses the verbatim language of Matthew 24:29, and yet was very clearly fulfilled centuries ago. Well, in Isaiah chapter 24 now, I'm going to begin reading in verse 4. The earth mourns and fades away. The world languishes and fades away. The haughty people of the earth language. The earth is defiled under its inhabitants because, well, I'm going to stop right there. Okay? Got a reason for doing that. I want to skip down to verse 18 and following. It shall be that the one who flees from the noise of the fear shall fall into the pit. And by the way, these are people fleeing from the destruction of heaven and earth. So let me ask you a question. if the day of the Lord is an earth-burning, time-ending event that's over in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, how can people flee from it? Can you escape it by running? Even if you had a Lamborghini and a Ferrari, could you get away from it? No. So, fear and the pit and the snare are upon you, O inhabitant of earth, and it shall be that the one who flees from the noise of the fear shall fall into the pit. The one who comes up from the midst of the pit shall be caught in the snare. Now watch this. Watch carefully, carefully. For the windows from on high are open. Folks, this is flood language. This is the destruction of heaven and earth in a flood. Oh, wait a minute. We're told, aren't we told? Well, you know, the Lord destroyed heaven and earth with a flood at one time, but he said, I'll never do that again. Next time it'll be by fire. And yet here we have a prediction of heaven and earth, the destruction of heaven and earth by means of a flood. Houston, we have a problem if we take this language literally. For the windows from on high are open, the fountains of the earth are shaken, the earth is violently broken, the earth is split open, the earth is shaken exceedingly, the earth will reel to and fro like a drunkard, it shall totter like a hut, its transgressions shall be heavy upon it, and it shall fall and not rise again. And by the way, the very next verse, verse 21 and following, it's the day of the Lord. So here's the day of the Lord, and here's the destruction of heaven and earth. Oh, but why? You see, I stopped reading in verse 5. The earth is also defiled under its inhabitants because, please catch the power of what I'm about to say. Isaiah 24 depicts a yet future destruction of heaven and earth for a very specific reason. Okay? Because they, now, let me stop right there. Because they, who is the they? Well, we go down to verse 10 and following, and we find that this prophecy is about the people dwelling in the midst of the city of confusion, which chapter 29 identifies clearly as Jerusalem. So this is a prophecy against the people living in the city that sits in the midst of the land. Who do you suppose that might have been? Who considered themselves the people, dwelling in the city, sitting in the midst of the land? Well, Ezekiel chapter 5, 8, and 9 tells us it was Jerusalem that sat in the midst of the land. Yep, the people, the city that sits in the midst of the land. That's Jerusalem. Okay, so back to verse 5. The earth is defiled under its inhabitants because they, that's the people of the city, that is the people of the city and the land, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. Now, if you compare this with Hosea chapter 8 and Hosea 6, 6 to 7, then you find this is clearly about Israel in violation of Torah. So let me ask you a question. Do you believe it? And you know, I've asked this question numerous times in countless private discussions. Does your eschatology posit the yet future destruction of literal physical heaven and earth at the time of a flood as a consequence of Israel violating the law of Moses? And normally the response I get to that is the old deer in the headlight look. I've had people literally just stand and stare at me with their eyes blinking. And then I've had people go, well, that's the silliest thing I've ever heard in my life. Well, why is it silly? Verse 5 gives us the reason for the destruction. The reason for the destruction is because of the people who dwelt in the city in the midst of the land, violating the everlasting covenant. And I've had some people tell me, well, the everlasting covenant here is God's covenant with the earth, the rainbow, saying, I will never again destroy every living creature. Well, wait a minute. That's a unilateral covenant between God and man. But here in Isaiah 24, it's the people who violated the covenant. They changed the ordinance. Look, mankind has no power or authority to change the covenant of Genesis 6. I'm sorry, we don't have that kind of power. But Isaiah 24 and verse 5 is talking about the transgression of the everlasting covenant, changing the ordinance, breaking the covenant. And again, that can't be a Genesis 6. What covenant did Israel violate? What covenant did the people dwelling in the city, in the midst of the land, violate? The law of Moses. And as a result, her heaven and earth was to be destroyed. And so here we have, and by the way, chapter 25, 1 and 2 depicts it. It's the destruction of the city and the turning over of the temple over to pagans. Destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Just like in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus was predicting the destruction of the city and the temple, and he spoke of it as the destruction of heaven and earth. Just like Isaiah 24 did. Just like Isaiah 13 used that identical language. The language is not literal and was never intended to be interpreted literally. Okay, thank you so very much for joining me for this Thursday's morning musings. Don't forget, get yourself a copy of my book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, or don't forget to take advantage of our May 2020 4-book special on the resurrection. Essays on the resurrection by Sam Frost. Oh, I'm sorry, that's The Triumph of Christ by Daniel Rogers. Essays on the Resurrection by Sam Frost. My debate book with Dr. David Hester of Faulkner University on the resurrection of the just and the unjust, and my formal debate with Jim Jordan on the resurrection. Shipping alone would be $25, okay? That doesn't count the cost of the books. But for May 2020, U.S. orders only, total delivered price, $39.95, I think is what it is on the website. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, order the May special. And again, this is U.S. orders only. And you look, this is some fantastic material on the resurrection. You don't want to be without it in your library. Okay, thank you so very, very much. Tomorrow, we will continue our examination of Romans 11, 26 and 27 in our refutation of Lance Conley's book, Hope Resurrected. I will see you on the flip side.